Well, if you don't panic, you see them. Then you get into the domain that Buddhists call suchness. It is just as it is. Now, if it's a big act, who's doing it? Who is the actor? What lies behind all this jazz? That's the big question. And it is through asking that question that we move from 6 to 7 into the state that I called late. Because when you become aware of energy jazzing this way and that way, and on top of this, you have already, don't forget, become aware that you and the outside world are a single energy system, then what is it? Do you realize, for example, I do not exist to I at all unless there's something else that's other. And that immediately is the clue to the fact that self and other are polar. They go together. How do they go together? All right, put it the other way around. What would you do if you were God? If you were the works? In other words, if you were this whole capacity for patterning energy, what would you do? Well, first of all, you'd have to draw the line somewhere and then proceed. You'd have to make a difference. Because if something doesn't make a difference, it doesn't matter. Does it? So, if you want to make matter, you've got to make a difference. Well, if you take that along and try all the amazing differences that can be tried, differentiate this from that, and so on and so forth, among all the possibilities of being God, you will eventually arrive at what you're doing now. To be it, just this sort of circumstance. Because this will be one of the infinitely many things to do, with certain restrictions on you, which, of course, you tacitly originated. Because you wouldn't know where you were without them. Then you suddenly see, with this astounding clarity, that the energy may symbolize itself to you as a sensation of intense light. You see, our understandings have a way of representing themselves to us in sensuous imagery. We say, when very happy, I was walking on air, or, you could have knocked me down with a feather, or, he saw the light. Everything became clear. Are you transparent? Now, these are not necessarily meant literally, but in intense cases of insight, there is a literal sensory feeling corresponding to the insight. When something becomes utterly clear in a way that is emotionally and intellectually overwhelming, you are liable to have the feeling of intense light inside your head. Sometimes there's a feeling that everything looks transparent, as if it were glass, but it's still there. You don't actually see through it. You don't see the pattern on the chair behind somebody's head, but they look transparent because things have become clear. It has become, at this point, blindingly clear that everything is it, the light, the energy coming on at you in different ways. And you are coming on at it. And it's all one coming on. You can see that light is the basic component of black things. There is nowhere that isn't light. And if you can't see it, you can hear it. Comes on at you in all kinds of disguises. So here you see it tabling. Here it's handling. And here it's revolting. Just dancing all sorts of patterns. And you're it. Now, as I said, this may clothe itself, this comprehension, in the sensation of vivid light as being the ultimate component of, you might say, the very inner stream of the nerve. Reduce it all down to what it is fundamentally. That's why, when you blow up the atom, you get this light because it's all locked in it. Then all you'd have to do was touch his brush to certain points. And what's this? A magnificent landscape would appear, but he had to reach just the right degree of drunkenness to let go and slosh the paper with his inky hair. One day, I was talking with a Zen priest who had been my student several years ago. He said, I had a letter from my teacher this morning. Oh, I said, that's interesting. How is he? Oh, he's fine, the priest replied. But he said he's very drunk. He drank too much. I said, this is your teacher? He goes, yes, he entertains ideas. He's my Zen teacher. He said he climbed a mountain, very cool. The only way to keep wandering sockets. And so, nobody has any feeling about it being bad. But it is a drug, and it is a narcotic in the strict sense of the word. One that, in quantity, will induce narcosis or torpor, even sleep. You see, though, the word drug isn't normally applied to alcohol. If a doctor asks a patient, are you taking any drugs at this time? The patient typically thinks of things like penicillin, sleeping pills, or barbiturates and says, no, I'm not taking any drugs. They forget to mention alcohol because it's not commonly recognized as a drug. So you see how loaded the word drug is. If we want to keep our conversation clean, we don't use it. There are too many double takes and funny associations. Instead, we say chemical, a nice neutral word. So, you see, there are states of consciousness that correspond to chemistry. Here we encounter another difficulty. There's a prejudice tied to the word chemical. To talk about biochemistry, as if life were entirely explainable or controllable through chemistry, feels like a reduction or put down of life itself. In our culture, there's a strong tendency for the mind to triumph over matter. That's why Christian Science and other metaphysical movements like divine science or religious science are so popular in the US. These philosophies often teach, think positively, and all will be well. Keep your thoughts pure and clean, always look on the bright side of life, and the material world will fall into place. But if it doesn't, well, be happy just the same. This mind over matter ethos is huge in America, but it's impossible to fully practice because we are also material beings. If you could perfectly practice mind over matter, you'd abstain from eating, never depend on the murdering business we engage in to survive. You'd renounce aspirin, vitamins, coffee, tea, any chemicals. And of course, no wine. Italian people, for instance, list wine under food when specifying their spending on liquor and other items. For them, wine is healthy and a natural part of daily life. The French feel the same way. So, you see how culturally relative these ideas are. It all depends on what you're used to and how you classify things. Chemistry in itself is just a way of describing what happens. You can describe anything chemically. Take an oil painting by a great master. There's a chemical description for it. Or a musical composition. You can describe it in terms of the physics of sound. But the language of chemistry is clumsy when trying to explain what an artist conveys through a painting or what Mozart expresses in his music. Similarly, the language of biochemistry can be clumsy when discussing intellectual or spiritual insights. Yet, there is a chemical aspect to all spiritual things, just as every photograph, be it of a saint or a striptease artist, relies on a physical grid for reproduction. So let's not be snobbish about our relationship to processes that can be described chemically or physically. Even the Catholic Church acknowledges that physical means, like water, can serve spiritual ends, granting grace through baptism, for instance. Bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. Using physical means for spiritual purposes is not inherently contradictory. I often notice, though, that people who elevate mind over matter too highly tend to carry a certain spiritual pride, an insufferable sin, as Christianity would put it. G.K. Chesterton recommended a spiritual exercise. Put your head on the ground, look between your legs, and see the world as if it were hanging from the earth. It's a humbling perspective. After all, people who are too spiritual are like pure alcohol, strong but without body. On the other hand, people who are too material are like grenadine, sweet but without spirit. We need a middle way. There are chemicals that can change consciousness. In my opinion, these can aid meditation. I remember a Chinese Taoist philosopher once said to me, "When you start meditating, you should have a few drinks. It'll speed up your progress by 6 months." It's a dangerous attitude and a very Chinese one. It may work for some, but it's not my preference. When it comes to chemicals like those labeled psychedelic, that term is practically meaningless. It means mind manifesting, but I prefer psychotropic, which simply means mind changing. These chemicals, like cannabis, mescaline, psilocybin, and LSD, aren't inherently therapeutic but can alter consciousness. Their effects depend on 3 variables: the chemical itself, the setting, physical and social circumstances, the set, the user's mindset and background. Because of these variables, it's impossible to generalize about their effects. Each person's experience depends on their unique set and setting. What we're talking about is the potential for these substances to act as tools, not cures. Like a microscope magnifies the unseen or a telescope brings distant stars closer, these substances might amplify inner awareness. Are such tools unnatural? Is it wrong to use a microscope or telescope? If we accept those tools outside our skin, why not consider tools inside our skin, provided they're handled safely? The key is balance, expertise, and intention. So, I regard these substances as instruments for investigating the nature of consciousness, which require careful use. Like all things that take you into unfamiliar realms, all exploring is dangerous. It's dangerous to explore outer space. It was dangerous to settle the West because there you encountered wild Indians. In this sort of situation, you don't encounter wild Indians, but you encounter psychoses. And that is always dangerous, of course. You might get into a psychosis, especially if you were predisposed to it in the first place. But just because something is dangerous doesn't mean at all that we shouldn't do it. It's dangerous. To practice yoga, you can go crazy with that. Lots of people have. It's probably less dangerous to practice yoga than to drive on the freeway. In fact, it's probably safer to take a ride by plane than to practice yoga or take LSD. But certainly, LSD is not as unsafe as driving your car on the freeway, or even around town. So, assuming the responsible use of these substances, remarkable things can be done with them. Let's consider the possibilities of each of the three groups that I've outlined here. I'm going to show, normally speaking, what they will do and how far they will go on their own. This one, cannabis, will of itself go about this far. In other words, it will add the dimension of sensory consciousness to the symbolic, pretty much on its own. Incidentally, cannabis is commonly known as marijuana, and it is a non-habit forming chemical. It usually has a calming effect, but it also heightens sensory awareness and intensifies perception. It's perfectly harmless if not used in very large quantities, and practically every medical authority who's ever published anything on it agrees with this position. It doesn't lead to anything except itself, unless, of course, somebody selling it to you is really trying to sell you heroin. Then they might try to tempt you, saying, "Come on, try some real good stuff." And their kids might say yes to heroin. But heroin belongs over here, it's a narcotic and moves in this direction. Cannabis, on the other hand, belongs on this side of symbolic consciousness and moves in that direction. It isn't that you are pushed around by them as a puppet, but that you and your circumstances, you and your environment are all the real you. That's what you're doing. And so, you experience, even though the circumstances may not be what would ordinarily be called harmonious. That is to say, pleasant circumstances. You realize that there is an unbreakable harmony between your behavior and the behavior of the external world. And so, this polarity becomes very important. But it can scare the wits out of you, and this is a danger point. If you say, "Now then, all right, if inside goes with outside, likewise good goes with bad." As I said before, you wouldn't know you were law-abiding people unless there were some criminals around to compare yourselves with. By comparison, you know that you're law-abiding. Well, now you begin to worry. If God goes with bad, who's in charge around here? Who? Who's to say what's right if, after all, everything works out in the end? If anything goes? And therefore you can start to get worried. How will I know? What will I depend on in myself that I will behave in what is considered a sane way at the next moment? Will I suddenly be overcome with a passion to kill somebody in Ireland? And in this way, not knowing which end is up because everything is so relative, it feels as if, when you put your psychic foot upon what you hope to be firm ground, the ground immediately collapses. You find yourself freely falling in space, and this is terrifying. You are afloat. You are in the floating world. You are in the relative universe, in which there is nothing to hang on to because the only thing that might be valuable to hold on to is you. In other words, suddenly the eternal rock, the firm foundation upon which the saints of the Lord are supposed to build, the rock of ages in which you're supposed to hide yourself, all that is gone. And it seems, at first, that there is nothing to cling to. And so, the sweat can fall from you until you say, "Well, that's really the way it always was. When I was born, I was kicked off the edge of a precipice, and I've been consoling myself all this time by hugging a big chunk of rock that fell off with me. But, there is no security. And if you go with it, you see, if you don't try to fight and find something to cling to, it's all right. Then you discover that the void you were so frightened of is the clear light. This thing that it isn't empty in the ordinary sense of the word at all. But once you let go of your clinging, that's all. You let go of it. There's no you to let go of, really. All there is to do is stop clinging, because what that does is bunch you all up. It's like going around like this. For the totally paranoid, thinking, "What's going to happen? Oh, come on. Loosen up. You can't do anything if your hands are tied up here."